Okay. So I turn it back over to Amanda and Michael. I know that there were a ton of questions in the chat, right?
Yeah, and I think I had one. I've noted one, but I think Michael ended up answering it. So I think we answered all of them during the seminar. Does anybody, first I'll start with, does anybody need any clarification for the ones we have already answered during the seminar? Or so then I'll open it up to any new questions or anything else that we can clear up. I know tax is a fun topic.
This is Diane White. I wanted to follow up. I asked the question about I work for 2 groups and I receive no benefits and no taxes are withheld. So I file quarterly taxes. So I wanted to know what was more appropriate, the W-2 or 1099. And Amanda, you said 1099. And I appreciate that.
I would expect that. You didn't fill out like a not like an employment form or anything when you first started or when you began work for them, right?
That's right.
Okay.
I mean, what I was having technical difficulty at the beginning of the call, and when the differentiation, I guess, between someone who is an employee of the church versus self-employed, but I think I'm self-employed. If I'm not self-employed and I receive a W-2, would taxes have to be withheld? Some taxes?
They are not required. They're not required to withhold anything, but you can voluntarily ask them to withhold enough to cover both your income tax and self-employment tax. So, I mean, you can be an employee of 2 different organizations. So, I mean, it depends on your relationship with those 2 entities as to whether you are self-employed or an employee. I mean, if you pretty much are just doing whatever you want to on your own time, using your own resources and getting paid for that without them directing what you're supposed to be doing, then if they consider you an independent contractor, then you'll get a 1099. But if you're an employee, they'll give you a W-2, and then you can voluntarily elect to have withholding.
Okay, or I could voluntarily elect, or I could just continue to not have it.
Right. You can continue to do estimated tax payments.
Is there, I'm sorry, y'all. I have another job too. I'm bivocational. And in that job, and it's nothing to do with the church. I am self-employed, and I'm a contractor, and the company I work with is very sensitive to the fact that it be clear I'm a contractor, right? And so I'm kind of sensitive to that. That's why I want to make sure that the church isn't vulnerable if they call me an employee, but I'm not, or if they don't call me an employee when I am.
Well, typically the IRS looks at a minister as an employee of the church for income tax purposes. And so they should be giving you a W-2. I mean, there was a time when a lot of ministers got 1099s, but IRS has been pretty clear in the last 15 or 20 years to say that if you are working for the church, if you are performing ministerial services for the church, then you are an employee and should be getting a W-2.
Okay.
So, I mean, that would be a discussion you should have with the elders of the church to make sure that that's being handled correctly.
Okay, and technically, when you say the church, do you mean a specific church or the broader organization?
It could be either one. It could be the Presbytery. It could be the denominational headquarters. It could be the local congregation that you're performing the services for.
Okay, thank you.
Michael,
do you mind if sorry, go ahead.
Michael, I just wanted a bit of clarification, and it may be understood by everybody. When you say you can elect to withhold from a W-2, then that means the church would be paying your taxes in on your behalf, correct?
Right, they'll withhold it from your paycheck. So if you get $1,000 and you want $100 to go in for taxes, and they'll take the $100 all out, give you $900 as your paycheck, and then that $100 will get deposited with the IRS. And then that'll be reported in box 2 of your W-2.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that. That's probably a simple thing for everybody to understand, but just wanted across the board that it's the church's responsibility if they agree to do that, to pay your taxes.
Right.
I mean, it's you're paying it, but they're writing the check and mailing it in on your behalf.
However, if you don't mind me stepping in here, having worked for a small church and recognizing that there are a lot of CP churches that are smaller, and several understanding that they are 501c3 organizations, unfortunately don't always file taxes or do any kind of IRS reporting, and thereby may not give a W-2 or a 1099. In that case, as ministers, and this has been my case in time past, we have to keep up with our own income and report on the Schedule C, as opposed to having any kind of input on whatever that line is, line 7 or line 1 of the 1040.
Well, technically, if you're an employee of that local congregation, regardless of how big or large they are, and whether they're a 501c or not, there's still the legal requirement for them to file a W-2 or a 1099. But in this case, as an employee, they should be filing a W-2. Now, it may be that the treasurer doesn't want the hassle of making tax deposits and filing 941s. And so they can say no if you voluntarily ask them to withhold, which would then put the requirement for you to do an estimated tax payment. But technically, they should be issuing a W-2 if you're working for that local congregation.
I'm not disagreeing with you on that at all, but I guess I'm recognizing the reality of how some things are, and
Right.
in fact, it's gone so far in time past that have reached out to the IRS, and an IRS representative actually said if they have not done anything with their tax ID in years, maybe even decades, then it probably would behoove that church to not begin at this point, and so just continue on with the current operation. So the church just continued on as was, and I would assume that many small churches are still in that same mode. So anyway, I guess I was just trying to give some input from the perspective of having been in a small church and having not received a W-2 or a 1099.
Well, you could still put the salary portion on line 1, even though you don't have a W-2, but you would still need to include it in your self-employment income. But if the only thing you have is income from the church, if you're putting it on the Schedule C, you just have to make sure that you're not deducting business expenses that are related to the salary portion of your income, as opposed to the portion of your income that may be coming from weddings and honorariums and things like that. In that case, it might be better to do 2 Schedule Cs, a Schedule C for your income from the church that typically should be reported on the W-2, and then a second Schedule C for all of your other compensation that you have, where you can then possibly deduct some expenses against it.
That's good. Thank you. That's helpful. There are a lot of small churches and ministers like that.
Right.
Anybody else have anything?
I have 2 questions, if no one else has to. So it said, he talked about how to get more money in your pocket, and suggested maybe a new car, a new computer. Help me understand how a new car can be considered a way to reduce your taxable income, or a computer. I understand a computer more than a car, maybe. It's surely not the full amount. It's just a portion of it, right?
Well, it would be the business use portion of a car, if you're self-employed. If you're an employee, then the purchase of a new car is not really going to help you because those unreimbursed employee business expenses are no longer deductible. And that's where you can maybe have some negotiation with your church and how they organize your pay package. Because a lot of churches will have a pay package that includes a car allowance, which is part of that accountable reimbursement plan, where you say, okay, here's how much I've actually spent in automobile expenses, which could include a portion of the purchase of the car or the interest on the car. But you have to report that back to the church so that they can, don't have to report it on your W-2. At the same time, other unreimbursed expenses like study materials, library costs that you have, dues and subscriptions where magazine subscriptions and things that are related to your job. A lot of churches will have a library allowance. And so they let you do that as part of your package. And then, of course, there's the housing allowance that we've talked about. I want to say a few more things about that in a minute after we get your second question, Pam. And then, of course, there's the salary portion of your package. And then a lot of churches will also pay you the 1/2 of your self-employment tax, but it's not paid in as withholding on those taxes. It's just additional compensation to help offset the portion that normally the employer would be paying.
Michael, to clarify a little bit more, so say you are self-employed. I'm asking you, Michael, and you do buy a car, and say 50% of it is for business. Would that be eligible for like a deduction in the first year of like a 179, or is it just a portion, the mileage and stuff that you can use in that first year?
Well, it depends on whether you use the mileage option, where you just take a set 53 cents a mile, or whether you take actual expenses.
I see.
I mean, in the case of an automobile purchase, you could claim potentially 100% of the business use of the car in the first year that you purchase it, along with actual gas, mileage, license fees, and so forth. But then you have to continue to do that for the whole rest of the time that you own that automobile. So it gives you something good up front, but then the next few years you may end up with a very small deduction. So there's kind of just, it's something that happens in 1 year, and the next year you might get hit with a much bigger tax bill. So you kind of have to consider that in what you're doing.
And I will say that if you do have a Schedule C or self-employment, mileage is something that is looked into if you get audited or looked. So I would definitely keep a mileage log. There's some free apps on your phone you can download for when you're doing business mileage expense, or also just a spreadsheet, but something to back up those miles and those expenses, because that is something that is easily overlooked. Pam, you had another question, didn't you?
I'll wait. There's a couple of more questions about housing.
Yeah, about housing allowance.
Yes.
Yeah.
So go ahead and talk about that.
Can I interrupt before you start getting into that?
Sure.
Publication 517 is very helpful in this. If anybody's doing their own taxes, publication 517 on the irs.gov website, it has 3 worksheets at the sort of in the middle of that document, and it will walk you through a whole lot of this information. It even has a Schedule C worksheet on how much to apply to that. It has the information regarding housing on worksheet 1. So I mean, that's something that's important for us as ministers to have as well. So my apologies for interrupting you, Michael.
No problem. That's good information. I didn't stop to look up to see what IRS pubs were sitting out there on that might deal specifically with ministers. So that's good information for everybody to have. There are 2 questions over here. One is there a maximum ratio for housing allowance versus taxable income? And then Steve made the comment that all of his pay from the church is classified as a housing allowance. And the housing allowance gives you really two benefits. One is it's excluded from taxable income, which is a great benefit because that number could be pretty significant as to how much income tax you pay at 15 or 22%, or possibly even higher than that. And then the other benefit it gives you is if you're itemizing your deductions, even though you have a housing allowance that's excluded from income, some of those expenses like your real estate taxes and your mortgage interest could also give you another deduction on your Schedule A as an itemized deduction. Now you have to have enough itemized deductions. If you're married, it has to be more than like $26,000. If you're single, more than $13,000 in order for you to get a benefit for that. But it can potentially give you a double benefit of exclusion from taxable income and then an additional deduction on your itemized deductions. But in terms of how much housing, the limit for housing is the lesser of your actual housing expenses or the fair market rental value of your housing allowance. And so I always recommend that, like Steve, he's including his whole amount as housing allowance. The benefit to that is if you end up with some unexpected housing expenses, a pipe burst and you get a flood in your house and you have all this extra work that has to be done. Some of it may be covered by insurance, but there are also deductibles for insurance. Some of it may not be. Then if you set your housing allowance too high, there's no penalty for that. It's just that whatever you don't spend on housing gets taken in as taxable income, because you have to set that number at the beginning of the year. You have to set it at the beginning of the year with the church or the organization that you're working for, and it needs to be outlined and stated in their budget and in their records that this much is your housing allowance. Now, you can make a change to that housing allowance prospectively. So if you decide in June that you want to do some additional stuff to your house, you can ask the church to readjust your housing allowance and make it more. But only the expenses spent after that time can be included in that. So you can't go back at the end of the year and say, oh, wow, I mean, I had an extra $10,000. Well, you just end up having to pay income tax on that. So I always say overestimate your housing, because whatever's not used ends up being taxable income, because we never know what might happen. And of course, the expenses that go into that number, and you do need to document this. I suggest that you give the church kind of an estimate of how much you think the number is going to be. It includes your utilities, your telephone, your cable bill, any furnishings that you may decide to put into the house, furniture, drapes, dishes, those kind of things, new appliances, your property taxes, insurance, your mortgage, both principal and interest part, so the full mortgage payment, or your rent payment if you rent, repairs, maintenance, yard work, cleaning supplies. So all of that kind of stuff can go into your housing allowance. And so, think about what do you spend to maintain that home? And anything that you spend to do that can be included in that housing allowance. And then when you get to the end, you say, this is how much I spent. And if you didn't spend all of it, like I said, the additional amount becomes taxable income. But again, the whole housing allowance is subject to the self-employment tax. So does that help with some of the questions on housing allowance?
I have a question on housing allowance. I know you mentioned that they needed to set that in the budget at the beginning of the year. I was working as the minister through the whole year, but I was licensed in March and actually ordained in September. But they, at that time when I was licensed, I was classified as having the housing allowance. But of course, that's not set at the beginning of the year in their budget.
Well, it said at the time that you became qualified to take the housing allowance when you became licensed and ordained. I mean, you have to have those qualifications in order to be subject or in order to get the housing allowance. So if it's not there at the beginning of the year, it's whenever you became eligible for it.
Thank you. And also I asked earlier, I guess, so on my W-2, it should all be just in one box then, basically?
If the whole amount is housing, then it should be in box 14,
Okay.
designated as housing allowance.
And I guess the income I earned previous to March would be salary box 1.
Right, right. And if you weren't a minister at that point, then they should have taken Social Security and Medicare tax out of it as well.
I believe they did. Yes. And then, oh yeah, the other thing I was wondering about, I guess this is a withholding question. For a while there, they continued to take that out, the Social Security, and then in the last couple of months or so, I guess they contacted the Ministry Works payroll people, and they just started changing it to where they were just giving me the full amount without any withholding. I don't know. I guess I'm wondering, is that even right? Or I don't know what's happening really, but.
Well, they should have stopped the withholding. They should have stopped the withholding once you, at least the Social Security and Medicare, once you became licensed and ordained and it became housing allowance. If they continue to do that, I would ask them to just take that number and reclassify it from Social Security and Medicare and put it in as federal withholding. So that you're getting credit for it as federal withholding. And then they should be able to get a refund for the extra amount that maybe the church paid on you that they should not have paid. But then I would ask, it's probably easier. Most of us are not disciplined enough in most cases to save the money that we need for taxes without having some withheld. And so I would ask them then to start withholding, again, enough money to cover both your, all of your taxes, income taxes and self-employment taxes. And set that up so that happens every pay period.
And then, so at the end of the year, I would just get that difference back in the form of a tax, or I'm sorry, I guess during the tax refund time, that's when I would get the difference back.
Well, the withholding would be reported on your W-2 in box 2. And then once you calculate your income tax for the year, that number would be subtracted from it. And if you paid more than what your tax liability is, both self-employment and income tax, then you'll get a refund. If you haven't had enough withheld and paid in, and you haven't made any quarterly estimates, then you might owe something at April.
So with through the church, though, with it all being classified as housing allowance, I guess I would just expect the full amount to come back as long as I spent that much on my house.
Well, the housing allowance is still going to be subject to the self-employment tax. So you're going to have 15% of that, 15.3% of that housing allowance is going to be taxed, is going to be the self-employment tax. So, I mean, there would be no income tax, but there's going to be self-employment tax on it.
Okay. I always use that TurboTax thing. This is my first year with this housing allowance circumstance. I'm trying to, and actually, I think the folks at church aren't really sure exactly how it's supposed to work either. But so I guess I need a SE. The self-employment tax is somewhere on there as well.
Right. There's a Schedule SE that you would fill out, which would have the total housing allowance on it. And then it'll walk you through and calculate how much is subject to self-employment tax. And so then that tax, there's nothing to offset that tax, or no deductions to offset that tax. And so that's what if everything else is housing except for the small amount you made in the first 2 or 3 months, then you're most likely going to just have self-employment tax. And so whatever withholding they have done will offset that, and then you'll owe the difference.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. And then I don't know if we have any retired ministers on with us, but as a retired minister, if once you retire, you can still designate a housing allowance. And so you can still get that benefit as a retired minister. I'm not sure how the retirement plan there handles that, but some of the denominations, they ask you to designate how much you expect the housing to be, and some of them just don't put anything down as taxable and say, okay, that's up to you to designate on your own tax return. But as long as you're not, as long as you're retired and a minister, then you can claim the housing against your retirement distribution. So if you're taking money from a retirement account, you can also designate part of that as housing, but it has to come from a church-sponsored retirement plan. It can't be money from an individual retirement account.
Okay, I think I heard what you said there. But for those who are actively serving, the church has to approve your housing every year. That doesn't have to happen for a retired minister?
No, because they're retired. There's no
Right,
church for them to report to. I know the Southern Baptist Convention asks you how much you want to designate at the beginning of the year, and then they put that on their 1099-R somewhere and say this much was designated as housing. The United Methodist Church, I don't recall them doing that. So they just report how much the gross distribution is, and they don't report anything as taxable and say it's not determinable. But again, you need to set that. I mean, depending on how, and I mean, you'd have to talk to Robert Heflin
Right.
to see exactly how they handle that there. But as long as you have, most of my retired ministers designate 100% as housing. And then that retirement income is exempt from taxation, and it's not subject to self-employment tax because you're not working for it. It's money that you've deferred and put into the retirement account, or the church or the organization that you're working for has contributed that. So it's not subject to self-employment tax once you're retired.
That is a remarkable piece of information. I am certainly going to ask Robert about that. I'm not sure if we have any retired ministers in our group today, but hopefully we are all hoping one day to be retired. And that would be a helpful thing. That's a jewel right there. Right. You've given lots of jewels. And folks, this is your time to ask any lingering questions. Amanda, do you think that most of the questions in the chat box got answered?
I think so. I just tried following up. I don't think we missed any.
I know we have just a couple more minutes with them, and then they're going to tell us goodbye.
Did I miss some? Does somebody ask?
There is a question on a comment on how living in a parsonage plays into setting that amount for housing allowance. Well, it's if you're living in the parsonage, then it would be the fair market rental value of that piece of property plus utilities that would be used to calculate your housing allowance. So they're not actually giving you money, but they're giving you the use of the parsonage. And so, what would that house rent for fair market value if somebody put it on the rental market? And you could ask real estate agents or some commercial property rental people as to what that value would be. But it's that plus the utilities would determine what the fair market value is for that, which would be the amount of income that you would pay self-employment tax on. But if they provide it to you when you're retired, then that's not subject to self-employment tax. And so that's excluded from income. And it would be, and your parsonage allowance would be excluded for regular income tax purposes as well.
I believe that Travis spoke to that in the video. He talked about the housing, how you would account for all of that. So I do encourage you all, when we get that video posted somewhere, to go back and listen to it again. I know the sound wasn't that great, but a second time through might help.
Okay, so a question: how do those of us who are not receiving a 1099 or W-2 verify housing allowance allocation? If you're not giving that information to the church, then I guess you just write it down in your records and say, this is how much my housing allowance is going to be. I mean, technically, whoever's paying you, if you're an employee of that organization, you should be designating it to whoever's giving you the payment. I mean, I've had some small churches and they designate, their pay package between car allowance, housing allowance, salary on the front end. But if you're not doing that, then the best you can do is say, this is what I think it's going to be. And in most cases, whatever you actually spend, you probably will be okay using for a housing allowance.
Michael, would that be an appropriate thing if you don't get a 1099 or W-2 to at least before the end of the year, give it to your session so that it's recorded in their session minutes?
That's another way that you could do it. I mean, most people who are getting 1099s do not have a pay package. They're just getting X number of dollars for doing whatever it was that they're doing. And in that case, I mean, like if you were a traveling evangelist where you're getting money from different congregations for showing up, then you just have to designate an amount in your own records because there's really nobody to give that designation to.
Michael, a similar idea. If at the end of the year, or I guess when you're doing your taxes and you look back over and you see how much your mortgage and things were, I guess that information that's not sent to the IRS unless there's an audit, perhaps? Is that?
Right. You just add the amount of the housing allowance to the Schedule SC and say that it's ministerial housing allowance. Only if they come in and do an examination would you have to justify how much that is and have the documentation to support it. You don't actually send in a list of your expenses.
Thank you.
Anything else that we missed?
I think Kim
Well,
had a final question. Retroactive.
There's another one about being way too low. I would go to the church and change it if I mean, at this point you've got a month and a half of income that you may be able to redesignate as housing. You cannot go back and retroactively change it. It's got to be prospective going forward. And so you just need to make sure that when you go into the next year as well, that you're designating a high enough amount to cover everything that you could possibly anticipate spending on your housing.
And then one final question from Cynthia.
Yeah, if I receive part of her income as housing, but I'm now living with her mom as caregiver, should I ask to receive all my income as salary, or can I use fair market value to offset the allowance? If you're living with your mom, I would offset the fair market value, rental value that you're getting by living with your mother, and use that as a housing allowance number. Because I mean, you are living somewhere and there is a value to what you're living. And even if it's your mom could be gifting you that as, you know, allowing you to live there without paying any rent or anything, but you still have a value for what you're receiving in housing.
Okay.
And one more plug for saving money on taxes that wasn't mentioned by Travis. You know, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church has a retirement plan that is available for you to contribute part of your income pre-tax, which means it goes into the retirement plan without paying taxes, except for self-employment tax, but without paying taxes, income tax on it. And so you can defer $19,500 this year into the retirement plan. If you're over 50, you can defer 26,000. So if you're not participating in the retirement plan, I would encourage you to talk with Robert Heflin about how to do that and how much you can do. And some of the churches and some of the presbyteries and organizations will match a certain amount. If you put in 3% of your salary, they'll match 3% of your salary. So you immediately have 100% return on your investment, tax-free or tax deferred. And then only when you start taking it out once you retire do you have to pay taxes. And in most cases, then you're going to be able to take that out as a tax-free housing allowance because you're a retired minister. So if you're not contributing to the retirement plan, I would encourage you to start doing that, because that's really the biggest thing we have now enabled to defer taxes under the current tax structure.
Thank you for that plug on the retirement. That's a good thing. Thank you. And I think that this has been a helpful hour and 28 minutes. Thank you so much. I don't know what these 30 plus people think, but I know every setting I go in, I try and talk about taxes and these issues, and I know nothing. And so you all gave some good information. As you talked and as I heard some of the questions, it made me think we probably need to create something like this for church treasurers, for them, to equip them to better serve the ministers. So I don't know if the ministers think that would be a helpful tool, something helpful. I think one person on here is not a minister, but a presbyterial treasurer, I think, George Mays, and I appreciate his attendance because he's listening to this from another perspective. So the more people we can get together on this issue, the better everybody will be. So I do appreciate y'all coming in. And anything else before we say goodbye?
Just reminder, I did put the PowerPoint slides up on the chat for you to be able to download. So if you want the slides, you can download that, and that's got some contact information for us if you have any questions.
Thank you. I will also post that PowerPoint slide where on our website or Facebook or wherever I find the place to put these.
Sounds good. Thank you all for having us.
Thank you much. We appreciate it.
Bye, y'all. Have a good